a podcast builds a trust layer with your audience. Like that is what is powerful about podcasting. Who cares if it's 100 listeners? Even if we set a goal and we get obsessed with that download number or those other metrics, that's not the metric that we should be looking at. We should be looking at that metric that we started the podcast for in the first place. I made thousands from the podcast by connecting with other people and having them connect me, and business deals that came out of it just from having a podcast and being able to connect to that person that he was interviewing. This is through a lot of research. The number one way to get people to listen to your podcast is to be guests on other people's podcasts. You're talking to the audience that you want.
This is the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast, where we are here to educate, equip, and inspire people to build extraordinary companies. We're so glad you're here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you can get updates every time we drop a new episode. Now let's get it started. Welcome to another episode of the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast. My name is Rick Meekins. I am your host as usual. And in the studio, we are gifted by Jonathan Armbruster. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here.
Very cool. We are so glad you're here. Guys, we're going to talk about podcasting, which is, one of my favorite things to do. So this is going to be a cool episode. Now check it out though. If you haven't done it already, I would be honored if you would like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get updates every time we drop a new episode. So as usual, without further ado, let's get it started. So Jonathan, you've been in the podcast business for a while. You've done other cool stuff. I want to hear a little bit about your journey. Can you give us a little bit of that?
Sure. Yeah. If I want to go way back, I started in the podcast business at my church over 20 years ago. I started volunteering on my church production team and eventually got hired on there. But I remember when podcasting first came out, and you actually had to have the iPod came out, and then iTunes came out with the podcasting, and you had to download the episodes from your computer to your iPod so that you can listen to it on the go. And we talk about downloads nowadays. Hey, we get this many downloads, that many downloads. That's where it came from, because you actually had to connect the device to your computer, not Bluetooth or anything. You actually had to physically connect it and then download your favorite podcast or your latest podcast onto your iPod so you could listen to it on the go. And so that's where I started. I started helping my church put their podcast. It was just a sermon. It wasn't a podcast. It was just a sermon podcast back then up on the internet, and edit it and those types of things. And back then we had to manually update an RSS feed. Most of you probably don't know what an RSS feed is, but it's basically code. Like we're like coding it into the page and then uploading it, and I would screw things up all the time. It was very detailed and meticulous. You had to get every little piece right so it wouldn't screw it up. But I've been doing podcasting for 20 years. Fast forward, the company I worked for last built a podcast network for them. And one of our podcasts over 5 years, so I was with them for 5 years. We started at zero. We launched their podcast, and at one point in their podcast, we had 1 month, we had 1 million downloads. So that was a huge, exciting, big point in my life to hit that number. And consistently they had 60,000 downloads a week. So they would have 30,000 plus on their newest episode drop, and then 30,000 plus on their back catalog. So, I learned a lot of what to do, a lot of what to not do on that podcast. And obviously the hosts, they were amazing and they attracted people to them. So they were great hosts. We had a leg up there because they were amazing and did a great job. But we learned a lot of things, a lot of key things along the way. And it was great. Now I have my own podcast business where I help people with production and strategy, and just help people that don't want to do it alone and want to figure it out and want someone on their team to help them grow their podcast. So that was
20 years in 2 minutes. I love it. I was thinking back to my experience with church, and I guess I'm a bit older than you because we had cassette tapes.
Yeah.
So we had to after the sermon, we had to duplicate, for everybody that wanted to download the podcast of the sermon. We had to make a physical tape copy and
Yeah.
find them and hand it to them, and they would pay their $2.50 or
Yeah. I remember those booths. Like we had like a little booth in the back
huh?
and they would record it. And then, yeah, right after the service, they put that tape in there and they had like 20 tapes over here or whatever. And they would hit
Yep,
record and it would quickly like put it all onto the other tapes. Yeah,
yep.
that was good times.
And we had the tape repair kit in case the tape snapped.
Okay.
Had to
Yes.
learn that piece of technology.
Yes. Yes. Good times.
So it's interesting when we think about podcasting. There are the people that they're the hobbyists. They say, hey, you know what? I like doing RC. I love RC cars. I'm going to do a podcast on RC cars. I'm going to talk about RC cars. Cool. Then you have people that look at it as an organizational objective. It's like, hey, I want to get more clients, or I want to get more visibility. But then there's that third category, and there may be more, but there's that third category of people that say, hey, I want to have a business of podcasting. That third category, what is it? Well, no, let's talk about the second category. So
Okay.
look, so in the second category, I'm a business owner and I'm like, hey, I want to drive more clients, for my business. How do I go about starting that process or how do I go about that process of starting to build that podcast? Just even from the conceptual side of things.
Sure. And I would say and that's the majority of the people that I work with is business owners, people that have a business. They don't want the podcast to be like their full-time gig. They have this other gig over here and they want the podcast to kind of support that and get forward facing in front of customers. Um, I would say, I think some clarity around that would be helpful for the audience. So if you differ a way to think about where the podcast lands in your marketing, because I would group podcasting into kind of the marketing side of your business, but not quite. So it's kind of it's a weird it's there's a weird placement I feel like for podcasting. I think a lot of people get this wrong. So a podcast, it builds a trust layer with your audience. Like that is what is powerful about podcasting. It builds trust and it builds credibility. So, Rick, I'm sure you remember this. And back in the day when websites started becoming popular, there's businesses that were like, I'm not getting a website. Who cares? And that was okay for a while. But after a few years of the internet being out, if you didn't have a podcast, your business wasn't really legitimate. Like it started to be like not legitimate. So I'm starting to see that trend with podcasting today, not in every industry, but in a lot of industries, especially if you're coaching, if you're teaching, if you're doing things where you're giving your expertise to people. I feel like that's part of it. And people, when you have a podcast, it legitimizes what you do. People will go and they'll see that podcast. They're like, oh, he's done 20 episodes, 100 episodes, 400 episodes, whatever it is. And they're like, oh, he knows what he's talking about. It's just like this. So that's the credibility side of it. And then the other side is the trust. And podcasts are known, and advertisers know this. They create trust quickly with people. It's just a very intimate, and for you podcasters listening out there, it's just kind of this, like, we're just talking to you. It's a very intimate two-way conversation here. We're talking to each other and we're talking to you. And it builds this layer of trust where you can trust the host and you get to know the host. And they have to do a good job of being vulnerable. But even if they're not vulnerable, it still builds trust. It's amazing. I usually tell this story. I think this story is hilarious. My wife does not listen to a whole lot of podcasts. She's just not, huge into podcasts. So, but every once in a while she does. And somehow she came upon a podcast she had never listened to before. And she's driving down the road and listening to that podcast. And she tells me later, she's like, hey, this lady, I listened to her podcast and I signed up for a call with her and I'm getting on the call with her later today or tomorrow or something like that. And I started laughing and I was like, that's what I tell people all the time. And she's like, why are you laughing? I'm like, you went from like, never hearing this person before in your life to listening to one episode to signing up for her thing. and talking a ton about what she was talking about. I was like, that's what podcasts do. They create trust. And there's lots of statistics out there about trust in podcasts. But to get back to your question of how a business owner can see that in their business is, so you have marketing out there. And I would say like at the place where people are just trying to like find you, discover you. That I say like, cause people get podcasts and social media mixed up. Social media is the place where people are discovering you. Social media, Google ads, Facebook ads, that kind of thing. That's where people first find out about you. And maybe they'll find out and it's a very shallow relationship, like very shallow. Like they're just kind of, okay, just kind of dipping their toe in the water to find out more about you. Or maybe you just popped up on their social media because it's an interest they like or something like that. So that's a place to get kind of noticed. A podcast is not that same thing. A podcast is a layer below that. I equate it to, in the business world, to an email newsletter. I think it's very similar to an email newsletter. So I think podcasts are very similar to email newsletters. And it's a different layer where you're actually building trust with your audience. You've moved past the, hey, I noticed you, to now I kind of like you and I want to get to know more about you. So that's where a podcast sits. It sits in that I kind of like you and I want to get to know a little bit more about you. And that's kind of a harder layer to work with, because I think a lot of people go at podcasting thinking I'm going to get on a podcast and then people are going to discover me, right? And it's not like that. Podcasting is the next layer of people already have discovered me. Now let me introduce them to my podcast so I can warm that lead up. So that's where it's more in the process where you're warming that lead up and bringing them in closer to your circle. And then you can start to sell to them and tell them, things that you can offer them that'll help change their life and things like that, because they'll naturally want that from you. They'll naturally, once they start listening to your podcast and start getting to know you, they'll naturally want to take that next step. They'll be like, what's next? I need more. I need more from this guy. So that's where it sits. But the interesting thing about podcasting, what I love about podcasting also, is that recording an episode like this, you could take that episode, cut it up into multiple pieces to take and use on your social media at that discovery phase. So I think that's where it gets mixed up. People think, oh, it's social media, but it's not. But it can be used in the social media realm as little clips or even a blog or snippets for your social media. Does that make sense? Did I answer that well?
It does. I think that the challenge, or where I have pause, is sometimes, and I would say this, with my first podcast, Epiphany Off the Cuff, it was kind of if we build it, they will come type of mentality, and so we had guests and we just got out there and we talked and, we had good shows, but I don't feel like we had a real strategic approach to getting people from, that top layer to, listening to the shows to, really converting into the business opportunities. Is that something that you see commonly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where some of the confusion is, like where you're saying like, oh, build it and they'll come. Now, let me clarify this. You definitely, like you said, strategic wise, when you get into podcasting, you need a reason and you need a goal. And you need to go for that goal. The goal for a business owner. Now, again, you talked about that third category. I don't know if we'll get to that, but that third category for like someone that wants to make it their business, their goal is to make the podcast as big as they can get it. But for a business owner, that's not the same. We don't want that goal. The goal should be something more along, I want to bring in X number of leads, or I want to bring in this amount of business, or I want to sell this X amount of money. So let's say like your podcast, it might only have 300 listeners, which you might be like, oh man, I know as entrepreneurs, like, oh man, only 300 people are listening. But if it's bringing $10,000 a month in, then who cares? Who cares if it's 100 listeners? So that's what I'm saying, like mind shift wise, because I think us business owners and setting a goal, because I think our business owners, sometimes we think We get, even if we set a goal, we get into podcasting or something like that, and we get obsessed with that download number or those other metrics, and we're looking at those, and that's not the metric that we should be looking at. We should be looking at that metric that is driving that we started the podcast for in the first place. And I've met some podcasters, that business podcasters, that their goal was to get into rooms that they never would be able to get into just calling somebody. But when they were able to call somebody and say, "Hey, I have a podcast. Do you want to get on it?" And they were like, "Sure." So I talked to one guy, and that was his goal. He didn't care about downloads. He didn't care about audience. He just used it as a way to interview people that he wouldn't be able to get in front of. And he told me, he said, "I never sold one thing on the podcast." He goes, "But I made thousands from the podcast by connecting with these other people and having them connect me, and business deals that came out of it just from having a podcast and being able to connect to that person that he was interviewing." So that was his goal. And that's a good goal too for a business podcast. Like maybe you just need more connections, and maybe you just want to get out there and start connecting with people that you wouldn't be able to connect with otherwise. That's also a great goal. But where was I going with that? I'm trying to remember what was the original question there. Oh, just like how to get people into your podcast and more people watching your podcast and get them down that funnel. I think there's a couple of different ways, and it should depend on your overall goal for the podcast. And this is what I tell people too sometimes. And this is kind of where it gets muddy, because sometimes the podcast might not be, you can't directly KPI it to the podcast sometimes. But so if the goal is to sell a widget, a thing, or whatever it is, time with you, whatever that is, and then so let's say I record a podcast, and then I have a 1 minute segment that I use out of that podcast that goes on social media. The temptation is to, like, if I'm still thinking downloads are the most important thing, the temptation is at the bottom of that Instagram reel to put listen to the full podcast, click here, when the goal was to sell them the thing, right? So why wouldn't we just point them to the thing? Like straight from that Instagram reel, we should be pointing them to the thing that you wanted to sell. We shouldn't be trying to build the podcast. We should be pointing them to the thing that you wanted to sell. The next step it may not be a thing that you want to sell. It may be it may be a free PDF or your free funnel, the next step that you want your customer to take in their journey, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that can get blurry sometimes when you're a business owner, because you're watching creators, you're watching the third category out there, and they're just trying to build their podcast and they're following overall, and you're following them and doing things that they're doing, when you just need to be doing business things. Like you just need to be like trying to get them to that next funnel. Like who cares if your podcast builds, if your podcast, clip gets them to the next funnel, and that funnel will sign them up for an email newsletter. And that email newsletter, you can mention your podcast and they can go to your podcast and become a warmer lead. And I think podcasts and newsletters feed each other better than anything. It's hard for someone to move, very hard. And I tell people this all the time, and they just need to think about their own selves and their own habits. But it's very hard to move someone from social media to podcast. People go on the device, they're in the place that they want to be. They're on Facebook because they want to be on Facebook. They're on Instagram because they want to be on Instagram. How often do you click off of something to go listen to a podcast? Oh, I saw that podcast. Oh, I'm getting off of Instagram now and going to listen to it. Very rarely. But one, that's because that's where people want to be. But two, it's also the app design. Like they don't want people to leave. Like they're very careful about not letting people out of there. They're good with you selling your, next step or whatever. They'll even help you do that. But when you try to get people off of that platform onto a different platform, that's very difficult. So you have to think through that marketing wise. So I think you have to think of a podcast. So going back to that question, you have to think of a podcast holistically in your whole plan to get in that customer journey, not just on its own, trying to grow it on its own.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. You know what I saw was cool the other day. I was doing my daily doom scrolling. I have to send my bestie like reels like every day.
Awesome.
But there was I saw several Spotify links. And so they
Mhm.
had, someone that had, just, a creator just had their Spotify link, and then you click and it takes you to, their Spotify channel or something. I thought it
Okay.
was the coolest thing.
Interesting. Was that from
Seems like
Facebook or Instagram?
was that?
Was that Facebook or Instagram?
It was Instagram, and
That's
it
cool.
was a paid ad, so
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
ads are, you can get away with that in ads for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not in the
Yeah.
not in the regular.
Yeah. 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 And, because you're paying them to let people jump off of there into something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. One of the
Yeah.
things I've been thinking about, I was talking with my team about was, we have to look at the social media aspect of things, because people, as you said, the people that are looking at reels or looking at, shortcuts are not, it's a different audience a lot of times than people that are going to actually watch the show. And you mentioned newsletters, but when we're distributing across, YouTube, iTunes, iHeart, Pandora, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what is the best way, or is it worth? Let me rephrase that. What's the best strategy when looking at the audio portion of this? Yes, video does, get a lot of, it gets a lot of visibility and that sort of thing. But you have your all the people that are in their cars listening to podcasts and at the gym and stuff like that. So it's a viable audience. But how do you build that audience?
Yeah, I think it's definitely over time. It takes time, and it takes a little back and forth between. And social media does help build that audience. It's just not a direct like one to another, right? It's not. So I wouldn't discount what social media does for podcasting. It definitely does bring people to podcasting. I also wouldn't discount. So I believe, like when I talk about podcasting, I'm a huge believer in the audio side of it. That is where the money is. That is where the trust is built. The video side of it is still being experimented with, and it's great and it's useful, but it doesn't bring the same kind of trust that the audio and the same kind of following that the audio does. So I would say the best social media that you could use for your podcast would be to build your podcast would be YouTube. And that's why I say the video side of it. And I feel there's a lot of people and the statistics that go to YouTube to find podcasts. Like they'll discover podcasts on YouTube, and then they'll go listen to them. Regular podcast listeners are watching YouTube or searching YouTube, finding podcast, and then they go subscribe on their podcast audio app and listen to it. So that's a great social media. Now, the number one, what I've heard other creators say, and this is through a lot of research, the number one way to get people to listen to your podcast is to be guests on other people's podcasts. The reason is that you're talking to the audience that you want. Basically, who's going to listen to podcasts? Like you said, like, is it going to be people that are Instagram, Facebook? Maybe they may also be podcast listeners. But if you're talking to podcast listeners, that's the best way to get podcast listeners is to talk to podcast listeners. So you see a lot of interview swapping going on, which I think is super helpful because it helps you build your audience and they help you build their audience. And I come on your show, you come on my show, and then we can build our audiences together like that. So I would say that there's a lot of ways. So in the list of ways, there could be 100 different ways to point people to your podcast. But in my experience, being on someone else's show is going to be number one. I would say a close second is the newsletter game, like figuring out a way to be on either, well, let me back up. I think actually before newsletters, I would say events slash workshops. In my experience, events and workshops have been a great podcast, like infusion. I any speaker that I know, if they're a speaker, I say you've got to talk about your podcast at least once during your speech, and you need to be very bold about it and say, hey, get out your phone right now and go subscribe to my podcast because I'm going to give you more of what I've given you tonight or whatever, Same thing on a workshop. It could be tricky on a workshop because you might have another goal for the workshop. But if you're just there serving someone else, then I would definitely at least let them mention, hey, they're the podcast, put that in your bio, podcast hosts of whatever, whatever. So let's say get on other people's podcasts, events and workshops. And then after that would be newsletters. And that could be your own newsletter or getting on somebody else's newsletter and people finding out about you there. Because I really do feel like it's a very similar audience and a very similar place where that happens. And so I think, and it's weird. I know it's like, well, I just want to build my podcast. Podcast can build your newsletter and a newsletter can build your podcast. So if you have people funneling into your newsletter from a form or from social media, then I would repoint them to the podcast. If for some reason they're coming in to your podcast from social media, then repoint them to your newsletter. So those two things should be building consistently. Those are, besides social media numbers, that newsletter list and that podcast is yours and you own it. There's a lot of things in this digital world that we do not own, but a podcast and a newsletter list is a lot more. We own that a lot more than those other things. So that would be my top recommendations.
Okay. What about the guest side of things? I mean, there's obviously, certain guests, bring some draw. I guess my overall question is, again, I'm a business owner. I'm not a podcaster. I need to set up a cadence, and as you always said to me, consistency is
Yeah.
extraordinarily important.
Yeah.
How do we make sure we've got a good stream of guests so that we can have that consistency? Good stream of quality guests.
Yes, that's important. And I feel like, and part of it's you too, and you have to be careful. Okay, let me say this too. With guests, again, it depends on the goal of your podcast, right? And if not everybody is doing guesting. Some people are just, speaking or teaching or talking and may have a guest on every once in a while. Other people solely are doing guesting. And let me say this caution first, before I answer that question, let me say this caution about guests. Don't let the guest, again, it depends on your goal, but if your goal is to become the person people go to in that area, if your goal, I'm blanking on the word right now, but if your goal is to become the guru of your area, then you got to be careful and not let the guest take over the conversation. And you still put in enough of your amazingness. And even if that's not your goal, you should still be putting in your amazingness so that you're not a news interviewer. You're a business owner and you know what you're talking about as well. Does that make sense? Like you definitely need to make sure of that. But when it comes to guesting, it is kind of it is a challenging thing to fill up 52 days a year with guests. I wouldn't be afraid to, if you have a good guest, to invite them back one or a couple other times that year. But you definitely need and I have this, I don't have it included, but I have have y'all ever heard of oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it. It's a sales technique. It's called 50. Gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it. But it's a sales technique where you list out 50 clients that you want to contact. I created a spreadsheet for podcast guests thinking of that same concept. So going out, LinkedIn, whatever it is, maybe it's just a wish list that you have of someone you want to interview. And you have to build that out. Like you have to build out, okay, these are 50 people that I want on my show. And then you start finding their email, finding their phone number, and then you start contacting them. And I have on that template, I have okay, I've contacted them once, and then it tells me, okay, if they don't contact back, here's, a reminder 7 days from now and 14 days. And so kind of builds that out just like you would for go after sales and things like that. So you definitely have to, and sometimes a VA could help you with that. I know there's companies that specifically do that. I don't have time for this, but there's companies that will specifically go out and look for guests for you. And so that's great. I would love to hear, because I feel like you do a great job of this. I would love to hear a little bit about how you do that.
You know what? It's really through networking. I mean, it's a lot of the time people in my network will say, "Hey, you should interview such and such a person," or it's really been interesting. I honestly haven't had to work extraordinarily hard, to find guests because of my network.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, if you're a business owner, you're networking. And so just add it to your networking. Treat it as a one on one. Like if you want to get to know this person, invite them to your podcast. I mean, if you already, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. Don't invite someone that's like you've never met before and you're not even sure like what they do or who they are. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. But make it kind of like maybe I wouldn't say it's like a first introduction, but maybe it's that second like connection call like that you do with them. So you talk to them once and you're like, oh, that was a great interview. Let's do this again. Let's join. You want to be on my podcast? I would love to just talk through you on my podcast. So that's great. Yeah. That's a good piece of advice. If they're out there and you're out there networking, then that's definitely easy to get people on.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I honestly get disappointed every once in a while when somebody's, just kind of ghosts me, but no different than any other type of sale.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's sales. It's sales. It's networking. It's all the things that we should be doing anyway.
Yep, yep, yep. I got a piece of advice, and I was kind of doing this anyway, but I got a piece of advice where you always do like a pre-interview, right? So you would have someone come in, just kind of get a feel for who they are, check the chemistry and that sort of thing. But someone told me, and I felt, yeah, I mean, I felt pretty confident in what she was suggesting. She said that if you come to your pre-show interview and you don't have a good story, I'm not going to have you on my show. What are your thoughts on that?
Interesting. So she was saying, if you don't, if we do a pre-interview and I don't like your story or you don't have a good story, then we're not aligned or something, or you're not going to be on my show or what?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So obviously, she's thinking about her audience. She's thinking about it from the perspective of, I guess we all think about it from the perspective of our audience. We want to make sure that our audience
Sure.
enjoys the shows.
Yeah.
So if we have, and so her concern or her thought was if they didn't, if the guest perhaps couldn't inspire the audience, couldn't instill inspiration or, whatever that was that she was after, then she would say, "Hey, you know what? I think that this might not be the best show for you. This doesn't quite align with what we're trying to accomplish." And I've heard other people do that. I interviewed someone a few weeks ago. Yeah, she was a non-traditional person, and she said that she got turned down from like half the interviews that she tried to get on.
That's interesting. That is very interesting. I've been doing this for a long time and there's definitely every once in a while you get somebody that's like, this didn't really work out. But okay, first let me say it depends on where you're at in your podcast journey, right? If you're starting out, just take
Yeah.
anybody and figure it out along the way and start building because really when people start out, and I say this even when they're starting out on podcasting, if they don't have a guest, they're learning their voice, they're learning how to communicate, they're learning how to share their own story. And so I think it's all part of the learning process, So I wouldn't be super picky. Yeah, if they're a taxidermist and you're talking about podcasting, that probably doesn't line up. I don't know. But hey, I might interview him anyway, just for the fun of it. But I think you have to be, I would lean somewhere in the middle there because I've seen people that have a small podcast and be so strict about who they let in or have like a page long of information that people have to fill out to even just become a guest on your show. And then I've seen professional podcast uh, hosts and have nothing. And they're just like, oh, yeah, here you go and fill it out and you're on my show.
And
And
you headshot.
so I think there's a wide range there, and I think somewhere in the middle. Make it easy for people to guess. I actually, for one client, I did this. He had a he had a form that he would have people fill out, and it wasn't a big form. It was just here's this, and this, and then find a date and do that and go there. And that was kind of one form that he had people fill out to be on his podcast. And it was simple. It was good. I liked it. It was clean. It was easy. It wasn't too difficult. And then, but then he was like, sometimes I meet people that they're like my dream that I want on my podcast. I don't want to make that person fill out a form. I just want them to just put their number in and put their email in and go. And so we created a separate form that was for like people that he absolutely already wanted to be on his podcast. And so we had kind of two forms. One would go like straight to that person, like if he wanted to cut through all the red tape and he just knows I want that person on my podcast. And then he had another form was like, here, you fill this out and then we'll kind of get to know. I like doing a somewhat pre-interview. I think you need to get to know someone, but I think you got to be careful. This is the director theatrical side of me coming out because I shot a lot of films and stuff too. I think you got to be careful pulling too much story out of that in a pre-interview and then coming to a podcast and you as the interviewer already knowing too much and them already have told you once and to have to pull it out and tell you again. It's not as raw and fresh. And so I honestly, Rick, I would rather err on the side of interviewing someone and it being a terrible interview and then me just saying, oh, I chalk that up to I'm not going to air that, or I'm going to really edit it and then air it, or something like that, or air it as a bonus or something. Do something like that rather than miss an opportunity, even that maybe I thought might not be great, but ended up terrific. So that's really my opinion on that. You know, it's very, I know there's lots of sides to that, and it could very well depend on where your story is. You might be a very busy person and you might have a very full podcast schedule. And so you can be as picky as you want. But if you're not, if you're just starting out, don't be picky for sure. But there might be a point where you want to be very picky, or it might be a very niche podcast and you have to be picky just because it's very niche and we, that's what we want. So I think there's some things that it just depends on what you're doing, obviously. But I think as a general rule, I would just rather, and it depends on you too, as an interviewer. You got to be confident and be an interviewer. And if the person isn't bringing the energy, you bring the energy. If the person isn't bringing the story, you bring the story, and you pull that out of them, or you just go up on your own tangent and start talking about something else.
Yeah. I interviewed a guy, did a pre-interview a couple of days ago, I think it was. And it was exactly what you said. I didn't want to have too much information, so I would be, but his topic was so interesting. I knew nothing about it. I'm just like, oh, this is just like amazing. I just
Yeah,
kept diving in. It's like, no, I got to stop.
yeah, exactly. 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 When I would so I did testimonial interviews at the place I used to work because we were ministry. And so we did testimonial interviews. And
Like
I got
people
to,
telling their story about
yeah,
like when they
telling their
first got.
story. I mean, it was a marriage ministry. So we were talking to people that were maybe on the brink of divorce or this or that. And so it was so emotional. But I got to the point where, and we usually did phone interviews and to just determine if it was something that we would want to spend money on going out and actually filming. And so I got to the point where I was like, somebody else has to do these phone interviews because when I do them, I'm going to hear everything. And then when I get there, it just doesn't have the same, it doesn't sit the same because you as an interviewer have just as much a role to play in that excitement level. Now, there's people that are just duds and they just aren't going to say anything, but you have a role to play in that excitement level and pulling it out of them. And I think some of that is you hearing their story for the first time and the way you react to it. And you're like, oh my gosh, wow, tell me more. And that kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm thinking about, as you said, we're not going to get to that third category, but I mean, I guess in a way that we are. We alluded to the fact that sometimes business owners want to come in and they want to start a podcast. They don't have the experience. They don't understand. They don't. They're not necessarily thinking about strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And so you've had your firm actually works with folks like that
Yeah.
to help them develop their strategy and do the production, distribution, that sort of thing. Can you talk to that? Because I don't know that that is something that a lot of people are aware of, that's available.
Yeah, exactly. So I ran a podcast network and we had, I think at the most at one point we had like eight or nine podcasts running at the same time, which we're recording, editing, posting, putting out, all the time. And so with that, I had to develop a system where we could track everything and keep up with everything. Now looking back, and I'm so grateful for that because I like to help business owners come up with a system that's sustainable where they can stay consistent. We've talked about this during this episode, but it takes consistency and time to build a podcast and to get it out there. And to be consistent, you have to have a system. And you know that. I mean, people know that as a business owner, that's what businesses are all about is building a good system to run on. But then when it comes to podcasts, they're like, oh, I'm just going to sit down and talk every few weeks and or every week and it'll go out there and it'll be great. But they quickly get burnt out because there's not a good system in place. So that is definitely what I like to help people with is building a system to be able to stay consistent and to be able to keep that podcast engine running. To give you a perspective, so here's a real statistic. There are 4.7 million podcasts in the world. 4.7 million. And this is a few days old. It's always growing. So it may even be more than that by now. But 4.7 million podcasts in the world. Only 700,000 of those, around 700,000, I'm using a round number, are active. Active meaning that they've put out a podcast in the last 90 days. And most podcasts fail before they get to 10 episodes. A lot of them fail before they get to 3. If you can get to 20 episodes, I was telling a client this the other day, they just passed the 20 mark. I was like, if you can get to 20 episodes, you're in the top 1% of podcasts in the world. Just 20 episodes and you're at 1%. So really, when we look at this, consistency is what wins in the end with podcasting. Being consistent, putting stuff out there. The podcasts that we see that are on top, those are podcasts that have been around for a long time, or they're daily podcasts, which are interesting too, because they're more consistent. So they get more downloads, more views, more listens. So consistency wins, but you have to have a good system put into place. And then there are people out there like me that will, like, our motto is you sit down and record, then we do everything else. Like, you just have to sit down and record, and then we'll take it all and produce it, publish it for you, turn it into reels for you, all of that kind of stuff. So there's definitely help out there, and trying to, as a business owner with everything else on your plate, also produce a podcast is a lot of work, especially if it's not your thing. But it's very important. Like, people more and more nowadays trust a face, not a business. And we're seeing, even in the large corporate world, them working harder to have a face of their business, right? I think we learned this from Steve Jobs. I think if we look back, he was one of the forerunners of this. Like, there weren't faces of businesses before him, really. Maybe Bill Gates a little bit, but he's not very out front. Steve Jobs was out front and he was like the face of Apple. And people fell in love with that. They fell in love with a person. And I think that's important for us to, whether it's podcasting or just getting out on social or whatever, as owners of the business, people want to connect with you, not faceless business.
100%. Well said. Well said. Last question for you. So the question I ask all of my guests, the name of the show is called "Our Relentless Pursuit of Winning," and I know we talk about consistency is one of the pillars I have a feeling you're going to talk about. As I always mention, winning is defined by the individual, but that relentless pursuit, that's the hard part. What would you recommend to someone if you were saying, I'm going to show you a way to pursue relentlessly?
I think having a goal out in front of you that is heartfelt, that is really something that comes from the inside of you. Sometimes we can set superficial goals. I mean, we just came out of January, right? I want to lose 100 pounds, or I want to lose this or whatever. And a lot of us know, we've read the book Habits. What's the name of the Habits book?
Atomic Habits.
Atomic Habits. Yeah. A lot of us have read this book, but he's got a lot of great stuff in there. A lot of us know that that is not a good goal. A good goal is, I want to be a person that goes to the gym. I want to be a person that eats healthy. I think when we set goals like that, it's a lot easier to get up every single day and get that 1% better, because that's really the goal. And then our world is so about the overnight success, and it never is overnight success. Rarely is it overnight success, but they're all into it. They're like, oh, and we praise it and we glorify it. And it's cool to see someone succeed. I'm not going to lie. I love it. But I think we see that and we get discouraged when we don't see that every single day, or try, and we're just getting, we're just putting in a little bit more. And if the thing is, if you don't quit, you win. And that's what I tell people all the time with podcasting. Same with exercising, same with life. If you don't quit, you win. You may not hit the goal that you wanted, but if you don't quit, you win regardless. So just hang in there and don't quit.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you so much for that. So, Jonathan, before we go, you mentioned that you have a giveaway for our audience. You want to talk about that a little bit?
I do. Okay. So one of the biggest mistakes I see podcasters make is thinking that they have a content problem when they really have like a systems problem. Your message may be solid, the calling may be clear, but you might not have any production workflow behind it. Episodes get delayed, or your editing takes too long, and you just don't get consistency. So I built a simple production planner that solves that. It's 20 years of my podcasting knowledge squished into this Google sheet, and have instructions on there, how you can use it and everything. But I want to give it away for free to you guys to help you better plan out your podcast so that you can stay consistent and so you can win.
Awesome. And if they want to reach out to you about it, or perhaps even working with you, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to find me is on LinkedIn. I'll give you my email address to jonathan@contentbuilders.co, not com.co, but that's my email address. But the best thing is just to find me on LinkedIn, Jonathan Armbruster. You'll see my beautiful face there and connect with me. And I'm sure Rick will have the links and the show notes as well. Absolutely. Perfect. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the show. I've enjoyed it. It was a pleasure. And me too. I had a great time. Always a pleasure with you, Rick.
Likewise. And folks, thank you so much for watching or listening to another episode of the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast. We'll catch you next time.